The hallways of the Belworth concert hall echoed with hurried footsteps as a young man rushed through the corridor, his worn backpack bouncing against his shoulder. He was breathing hard, having sprinted from the bus stop 3 blocks away. The prestigious symphony orchestra had already begun their morning rehearsal, and he was late. Not the first impression he had hoped to make. The man's name was Lee, and he wasn't supposed to be here at all. The orchestra's regular pianist had fallen ill just 2 days ago with a severe case of the flu. Lee had received the call while working his night shift at a small jazz club downtown. The symphony needed a replacement pianist, immediately for their upcoming performance of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3, one of the most technically challenging pieces in classical music. Lee had traveled, nearly nonstop for 3 days, sleeping on buses and trains, surviving on convenience store sandwiches and coffee. His clothes were rumpled, his hair uncombed, but none of that mattered. This was his chance, the opportunity he had been waiting for since he first touched a piano keyboard at age 4. As Lee approached the rehearsal hall doors, he heard the orchestra tuning their instruments. The sound made his heart race even faster. Behind those doors sat some of the finest musicians in the country, led by the legendary Maestro Harrington, known both for his brilliant interpretations and his fiery temper. Lee took a deep breath, straightened his wrinkled shirt as best he could, and pushed open the door. The vast rehearsal space fell quiet as he entered. 50 pairs of eyes turned to stare at the disheveled newcomer. At the conductor's podium stood Maestro Harrington, tall, imposing, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to cut right through Lee. "You must be the replacement," the maestro said, his voice carrying across the room without effort. There was no warmth in his tone. "You're late." "I'm sorry, sir," Lee replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "My bus was delayed and The maestro waved away his explanation. "Your credentials were acceptable, though I've never heard of your conservatory. Let's not waste any more time. The piano is ready." Lee nodded gratefully and made his way toward the magnificent grand piano that sat at the center of the orchestra. It was a Steinway Model D, the finest concert grand piano money could buy. The sight of it made Lee's fingers tingle with anticipation. Without thinking, Lee set down his backpack and immediately reached for the piano, running his fingers lightly over the polished black surface. It was a gesture of reverence, the way someone might touch a sacred object. He hadn't even greeted the other musicians or properly introduced himself to the maestro. In his exhaustion and excitement, all social protocols had flown from his mind. All that existed was the piano. "Don't touch my piano, poor guy," the conductor shouted, his voice booming through the rehearsal hall like a thunderclap. Lee jerked his hand back as if burned. The entire orchestra stared, some with surprise, others with barely concealed amusement. A few of the violin players exchanged glances and suppressed smiles. "That is a perfectly tuned, perfectly prepared instrument," Maestro Harrington continued, his face flushing with anger. "Not some pub piano to be pawed at without proper introduction. Who taught you your manners, boy?" Lee felt his face grow hot with embarrassment. "I apologize, Maestro. I meant no disrespect." The conductor regarded him with cold eyes. "This orchestra has standards, not just in musicianship but in professionalism. You arrive late looking like you've slept in a train station. Bus station, actually," Lee murmured before he could stop himself. A cellist in the front row coughed to hide a laugh. The maestro's expression darkened further. "You find this amusing? Perhaps you think the Belworth Symphony Orchestra is some kind of joke." "Let me assure you, young man, we are not." Lee swallowed hard. "No, sir. I take this very seriously, more seriously than anything in my life." Something in his tone must have reached the conductor because after a moment of tense silence, Maestro Harrington gave a curt nod. "Very well. Since you're here, we might as well see if those impressive recommendations were accurate or merely the product of someone's overactive imagination. The score is on the piano. We begin from the first movement." Lee approached the piano again, this time with appropriate reverence. He noticed that the bench had been adjusted for someone much taller. As he sat and made adjustments, he could feel the skeptical gaze of every musician in the room. The first chair violinist, an older woman with elegant posture and graying hair tied back in a neat bun, gave him a small, encouraging smile. It was the only friendly gesture he'd received since entering the room, and Lee felt absurdly grateful for it. He glanced at the score, Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3 in D minor. Lee knew this piece by heart, had dreamed of performing it with a full orchestra since he was 12. But knowing a piece and performing it under the critical eye of Maestro Harrington were two very different things. "We don't have all day," the maestro said sharply. "Whenever you're ready, if you're ready." Lee positioned his fingers over the keys, trying to ignore how his hands trembled slightly. The lack of sleep, the long journey, the hostile reception, all of it threatened to overwhelm him. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to center himself. "Eyes open, if you please," came the maestro's voice. "This isn't a nightclub performance." Lee's eyes snapped open. He nodded, took a deep breath, and began to play the opening notes. The first movement started with a simple, haunting melody played by the piano alone. As Lee's fingers moved across the keys, he felt something shift inside him. The exhaustion, the anxiety, the doubt all began to fade away. There was only the music now. The orchestra joined in, and suddenly Lee wasn't alone anymore. He was part of something larger, something magnificent. He could feel the music flowing through him, connecting him to every musician in the room. But as the piece progressed to more technically demanding passages, Lee became increasingly aware of the maestro's critical gaze. His tempo was slightly off, too fast in some places, too hesitant in others. The lack of sleep was affecting his precision. "Stop, stop, stop." Maestro Harrington rapped his baton against the stand. The music came to an abrupt halt. "What was that?" "You're rushing through the arpeggios as if you're trying to catch a bus. This is Rachmaninoff, not a race." Lee nodded, trying not to show how the criticism stung. "Yes, maestro. I understand. Do you? Because it doesn't sound like it." Again from measure 42. They tried again and again. The maestro stopped them. "No, no, no. You're playing the notes, but where is the feeling? Where is the soul?" By the third attempt, Lee could see the orchestra growing restless. Some were exchanging glances that clearly said they didn't believe he was up to the task. The pressure was mounting, and Lee felt his confidence slipping away. During a particularly difficult passage, his fingers stumbled over the keys. It wasn't a major mistake, most listeners wouldn't even have noticed, but in this room with these musicians, it might as well have been a thunderous wrong note. The maestro sighed dramatically and put down his baton. "Perhaps we've made a mistake. Your technical skills are acceptable, but this concerto requires more than mere technical proficiency. It requires artistic maturity that I'm not hearing." Lee felt a wave of panic. After everything, the call, the grueling journey, the hope that had sustained him through sleepless nights, he couldn't fail now. "Please, maestro," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I know I can do better. I've barely slept in 3 days trying to get here. If I could just have a moment to collect myself." The first chair violinist spoke up. "Maestro, perhaps we should take a short break. It's nearly time for our usual mid-morning rest anyway." Maestro Harrington checked his watch and frowned. "Fine, 10 minutes. When we return, I expect to hear a different pianist, either in skill or in person." The musicians set down their instruments and began to file out of the hall. Lee remained seated at the piano, too exhausted and disappointed to move. He had traveled so far, sacrificed so much, only to fall at the first hurdle. The first chair violinist approached the piano. "Don't let him get to you," she said quietly. "Harrington tests all newcomers like this. It's his way." Lee looked up, surprised by the kindness. "Thank you, but I really did play poorly." "You played like someone who hasn't slept in days," she corrected. "There's a difference." "I'm Min, by the way." "Lee, nice to meet you." Min smiled. "There's a small practice room down the hall. Third door on the right. It has a decent upright piano. Why don't you go splash some cold water on your face? Have some coffee from the break room and then use those 10 minutes to center yourself. Play something, anything, just to remember why you love the piano." Lee nodded gratefully. "Thank you. I will." As Min walked away, Lee gathered his courage. This opportunity meant everything to him. His whole life, people had told him his dreams were too big, that someone from his background couldn't make it in the world of classical music. He'd fought against those expectations every step of the way. He wasn't about to give up now, not after coming so far, not after sacrificing so much. Whatever it took, he would prove to Maestro Harrington and the entire Bellworth Symphony Orchestra that he belonged here, that the piano wasn't just an instrument he played, but a part of who he was. With renewed determination, Lee stood up and headed for the door. He had 10 minutes to turn everything around. 10 minutes to save his dream. Lee splashed cold water on his face in the small bathroom next to the practice rooms, watching as droplets ran down his tired features in the mirror. Dark circles hung beneath his eyes, evidence of his 3-day journey to reach the Belworth Symphony Orchestra. He patted his face dry with a rough paper towel and took a deep breath. "You can do this," he whispered to his reflection. "This is your moment." With renewed determination, Lee headed toward the practice room Min had suggested. He found it easily, the third door on the right, just as she'd said. Inside was a modest, upright piano, nowhere near as magnificent as the Steinway in the rehearsal hall, but it would serve his purpose. Lee sat at the bench and closed his eyes, letting his fingers rest lightly on the keys. He needed to clear his mind, to reconnect with the music that had been his constant companion since childhood. Without thinking, he began to play a simple piece from memory, a Bach prelude he'd learned when he was 10. The familiar notes flowed effortlessly, and he felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. As the final notes of the prelude faded, Lee heard a soft knock at the door. It was Min holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. "I thought you might need this," she said, offering him one of the cups. "You look like you haven't slept in days." "Thank you," Lee said gratefully, taking the coffee. The warmth of the cup felt good in his hands. "And I haven't, not properly anyway." "How did you end up here?" Min asked, leaning against the wall. "Our regular pianist Zhao rarely gets sick. When he called in with the flu, the maestro was beside himself." Lee took a sip of coffee, feeling the caffeine begin to work its magic. "I got a call from my old professor 2 days ago. He said there was an emergency opening with the Belworth Symphony and he'd recommended me. I was working at a jazz club downtown when I got the message. I quit on the spot and caught the first bus I could find." Min raised her eyebrows. "You quit your job?" "It wasn't much of a job," Lee shrugged. "Playing background music while people eat overpriced appetizers. This?" He gestured around him, indicating the orchestra, the hall, the opportunity. "This is what I've dreamed of my whole life." Min nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Well, you've got about 5 minutes to make that dream come true. Harrington can be difficult, but he respects talent. If you can show him what you're capable of, he'll come around." "Any advice?" Lee asked, draining the last of his coffee. "Just one thing," Min said, her expression serious. "Play from here." She pointed to her heart. "Not from here." She tapped her head. "Harrington can tell the difference." With that, she left, closing the door quietly behind her. Lee set down his empty cup and returned to the piano. He had a few minutes left to prepare himself. This time, instead of Bach, he began to play snippets of the Rachmaninoff Concerto, the very piece he would need to perform with the orchestra. His fingers danced across the keys, finding the complex patterns that had given so many pianists trouble. As he played, Lee found himself closing his eyes again. It was an old habit, one that helped him focus entirely on the music. With his eyes shut, he could see the notes in his mind, could feel the music more deeply. His old piano teacher had tried to break him of this habit, insisting that he needed to read the music properly. But Lee had never been able to stop completely. The minutes flew by, and soon it was time to return to the rehearsal hall. Lee felt better, not fully rested, but more centered, more ready. The coffee had helped, and so had Min's kindness. When Lee re-entered the hall, the musicians were already returning to their seats. He made his way to the grand piano, aware of the curious glances following him. Maestro Harrington stood at his podium, his expression as stern as before. "I hope our little break has given you time to reconsider your approach," the conductor said, his voice carrying across the room. "Shall we try again?" Lee nodded, sitting down at the piano bench. He adjusted it slightly, positioning his fingers over the keys. This time, there was no trembling. "From the beginning," Maestro Harrington instructed, raising his baton. Lee began to play the opening theme, his fingers pressing into the keys with confidence. The simple, haunting melody flowed from the piano, filling the rehearsal hall. When the orchestra joined in, Lee felt that connection again, the magical link between his playing and the collective sound of the instruments around him. This time, as the piece progressed to the more technically demanding sections, Lee didn't falter. His fingers found each note with precision, dancing across the keyboard in the complex patterns Rachmaninoff had written. The exhaustion was still there, pulling at the edges of his consciousness, but Lee pushed through it. focusing entirely on the music, almost without realizing it. As he reached a particularly challenging passage, Lee's eyes drifted closed. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he could see the music more clearly, could feel it flowing through him like a current. His body swayed slightly as he played, carried by the emotions of the piece. Suddenly, the orchestra fell silent, though Lee continued playing for several measures before realizing he was now performing solo. His eyes snapped open to see Maestro Harrington staring at him with an unreadable expression. "What are you doing?" the conductor asked. Lee's fingers froze over the keys. "I'm sorry, Maestro. I was playing the concerto." "With your eyes closed," Harrington said flatly. "Is this some kind of performance art? Are you trying to show off?" "No, sir," Lee replied, feeling his face flush with embarrassment. It helps me focus on the music." "It helps you focus," Harrington repeated skeptically. "This isn't a jazz club where you can sway and emote for the audience. This is classical music. Structure, discipline, precision," Lee nodded, properly chastised. "Yes, Maestro. It won't happen again." "See that it doesn't," Harrington said. Then, almost grudgingly, he added, "Your playing was improved. Perhaps you should take coffee breaks more often." A few of the musicians chuckled softly at this, and Lee felt some of the tension in the room dissipate. From measure 64, the conductor instructed, raising his baton once more. They continued through the first movement, and Lee made a conscious effort to keep his eyes open, fixed either on the score before him or on the maestro's baton. It was harder this way. He felt disconnected, as if there was a barrier between himself and the music, but he managed to play competently. When they reached the cadenza, a lengthy solo section for the piano, Harrington lowered his baton and the orchestra fell silent, waiting for Lee's solo to conclude before they would rejoin. This was one of the most challenging parts of the concerto, a test of both technical skill and artistic interpretation. Lee began the cadenza well, his fingers finding the complicated patterns with practiced ease. But as the solo continued, he felt that familiar pull, the desire to close his eyes, to immerse himself fully in the music. He resisted, keeping his gaze fixed on the keys, but something was missing from his performance. The notes were all correct, but they lacked the emotional depth, the soul that the piece demanded. As he neared the end of the cadenza, Lee glanced up to see Harrington watching him with narrowed eyes. The conductor's expression was one of puzzlement, as if he couldn't quite figure out what was wrong with Lee's playing. Lee knew what was wrong. He was fighting against his natural instincts, trying to be the kind of pianist he thought Harrington wanted, rather than the pianist he truly was. When the orchestra rejoined and they completed the first movement, Harrington set down his baton with a sigh. "Technically proficient," he said, "but something is lacking. It's as if you're holding back, afraid to fully commit to the piece." Lee wanted to explain, to tell the conductor that he was indeed holding back, fighting against his instinct to close his eyes to feel the music rather than simply play it. But he remained silent, nodding in acknowledgement of the criticism. "We'll take a longer break now," Harrington announced to the orchestra. 45 minutes. When we return, we'll work on the second movement." As the musicians began to disperse, Lee remained at the piano, staring at the keys in frustration. He had played better than before, but still hadn't shown what he was truly capable of. He felt caught between two conflicting desires, the need to impress Maestro Harrington and the urge to play the music as he felt it. Min approached the piano, her violin tucked under her arm. "That was much better," she said encouragingly. "Not good enough," Lee replied, running his fingers lightly over the keys without pressing them. "He still thinks I'm not right for this." "He's intrigued," Min corrected. "I've known Harrington for 15 years. If he truly thought you weren't right, he would have dismissed you already." She paused, then added, "I noticed you struggling to keep your eyes open during the cadenza." Lee looked up, surprised. "You saw that?" Min nodded. "It's your natural way of playing, isn't it? With your eyes closed?" "Since I was a kid," Lee admitted. "My teachers always tried to break me of the habit, but that's when your playing comes alive," Min finished for him. "Exactly." Lee sighed. "How did you know?" "I could hear the difference," she said simply. "When you started the cadenza, your playing was precise but mechanical. Then, for a brief moment near the end, something changed. The music became more fluid, more expressive. I glanced over and saw your eyes were almost closed before you caught yourself and opened them again." Lee didn't know what to say. Min had perceived exactly what he'd been feeling. Harrington values tradition, Min continued, but he values brilliant music more. If you want to convince him, you need to show him why you play the way you do. Don't just tell him. Make him hear the difference. With those words, Min left Lee to consider her advice. As the rehearsal hall emptied, he remained at the piano, thinking about what she had said. Make him hear the difference. Could it really be that simple? During the 45-minute break, Lee found a quiet corner in the concert hall's cafeteria. He sat alone, picking at a sandwich he'd bought more out of necessity than hunger. His mind kept replaying Min's words. Make him hear the difference. The other musicians sat in small groups, chatting and laughing together. Occasionally, someone would glance in Lee's direction, curious about the newcomer who had dared to challenge the maestro's authority. Lee kept his head down, too focused on his upcoming performance to worry about making friends. Min entered the cafeteria, spotted Lee, and walked over with her lunch tray. Mind if I join you? She asked. Please, Lee said, grateful for the company. She sat down across from him. You're overthinking it, she said without preamble. Lee looked up, surprised. What? I can see it on your face, Min explained, unwrapping her sandwich. You're trying to solve this like it's a math problem. Music isn't math. Technically it is, Lee said with a small smile. Frequencies, intervals, rhythmic divisions. Min waved her hand dismissively. Yes, we all took music theory. But you know what I mean. You're trying to calculate how to impress Harrington instead of just showing him who you really are as a musician. Lee sighed, setting down his barely touched sandwich. It's not that simple. This opportunity means everything to me. I can't risk losing it because of a quirk in how I play. Is that all it is? A quirk? Min asked, fixing him with a penetrating gaze. Or is it something more? Lee was silent for a moment. No one had ever asked him that question before. His teachers, his family, even his friends had always seen his habit of closing his eyes while playing as something to overcome, something to fix. He'd never really considered that it might be essential to his artistry. When I close my eyes, he said slowly, trying to find the right words, the music becomes more than notes on a page. I can see it almost like colors or shapes. I can feel it more deeply. It's hard to explain. Min nodded, understanding in her eyes. That sounds like synesthesia. Some musicians have it. They experience music as colors or textures. Maybe, Lee said, considering the idea. I've never put a name to it. I just know that when my eyes are open, I'm playing the piano. When my eyes are closed, I become the music. That's exactly what Harrington needs to hear, Min said, leaning forward, and more importantly, what he needs to see. But he explicitly told me not to close my eyes, Lee protested, because he thinks it's an affectation. A showy habit picked up from playing in jazz clubs, Min countered. He doesn't understand that it's integral to how you interpret the music. Lee considered her words as they finished their lunch. The idea of deliberately going against the maestro's instructions was frightening, but Min's confidence gave him courage. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps he needed to stop trying to be the pianist Harrington wanted and simply be the pianist he truly was. As they walked back to the rehearsal hall, Min gave his arm a gentle squeeze. Trust your instincts, she said quietly before returning to her seat among the first violins. Lee made his way to the grand piano, settling himself on the bench as the rest of the orchestra filed in. Maestro Harrington arrived last, his expression as imposing as ever as he took his place at the podium. Second movement, he announced without preamble, raising his baton, from the beginning. The second movement of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3 was a complete contrast to the first, slower, more reflective, with long lyrical passages for the piano. Lee's fingers moved across the keys with precision, but as before he felt that disconnection, that barrier between himself and the music. After several minutes, Harrington stopped the orchestra. No, he said, frustration evident in his voice. There's no feeling, no emotion. You're playing the notes correctly, but that's not enough. This movement is the heart of the concerto. It should make people weep. Lee nodded, feeling the weight of the maestro's disappointment. He glanced around at the orchestra members, many of whom were watching him with expressions ranging from sympathy to skepticism. His gaze met Min's, and she gave him a small, encouraging nod. Let's try again, Harrington said with a sigh. And this time, put your heart into it. Lee took a deep breath, positioning his fingers over the keys once more. As the maestro raised his baton, Lee made a decision. He would play the way he needed to play, the only way he truly could. The orchestra began the introduction to the second movement. Lee waited for his entrance, counting the measures. When it was time for the piano to join, he began to play, his fingers finding the keys with practiced ease. At first, he kept his eyes open, watching the score, watching the maestro's baton. But as the music progressed to a particularly emotional passage, Lee let his eyelids drift closed. Immediately, the music transformed in his mind. He could see it, blues and purples swirling together, deep and melancholy. He could feel it in his chest, a beautiful ache that transferred from his heart to his fingertips. Lee swayed slightly as he played, completely immersed in the music. He forgot about the orchestra, forgot about Maestro Harrington, forgot about everything except the story the music was telling. His fingers seemed to know where to go on their own, finding each note with perfect precision and feeling. He was so absorbed that he didn't immediately notice when the orchestra stopped playing. It took several measures before he realized he was playing alone. Lee's eyes snapped open to see Maestro Harrington staring at him, his baton lowered to his side. The entire hall was silent. Lee's hands froze above the keys, his heart pounding. Had he made a terrible mistake? "Why did you do that?" Harrington asked, his voice unnervingly quiet. Lee swallowed hard. "Do what, Maestro?" "Close your eyes, after I specifically instructed you not to." Lee glanced at Min, who gave him a subtle nod of encouragement. It was time to speak his truth. "Because it's the only way I can truly play the music, sir," Lee said, his voice steady despite his nerves. "When my eyes are closed, I don't just play the notes, I see them, feel them. The music becomes something I can touch, something I can shape with my hands and my heart." "That sounds like nonsense," Harrington said dismissively. "A convenient excuse." "It's not an excuse," Lee insisted, a trace of defiance in his tone. "It's how I've always played ever since I was a child. My teachers tried to break me of the habit, but when I play with my eyes open, something essential is lost. You heard it yourself just now. The difference between the first part when my eyes were open and the second when they were closed." The maestro was silent for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to Min. "First chair. What did you hear?" Min straightened in her seat. "Two different pianists, Maestro. The first was technically proficient, but mechanical. The second was an artist." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the orchestra. Several musicians nodded, and Lee felt a surge of gratitude for their support. Harrington turned back to Lee, his eyes narrowed. "Play the cadenza from the first movement again. First with your eyes open, then with them closed. Let's test this theory of yours." Lee nodded, positioning his hands over the keys. He began the cadenza, his eyes fixed on the keyboard. He played each note correctly, maintaining a steady tempo, executing the runs and arpeggios with technical precision. It was good playing, even excellent by most standards, but it lacked something vital. When he finished, Harrington nodded. "Now close your eyes." Lee took a deep breath and began again, this time allowing his eyes to close as soon as his fingers touched the keys. The transformation was immediate and undeniable. The same notes, the same tempo, and yet everything was different. The music seemed to come alive under his hands, each phrase telling a story, each chord resonating with emotion. Lee's body moved with the music, his face expressing the feelings that flowed through his fingers. When the final notes of the cadenza faded away, Lee opened his eyes to find the entire orchestra watching him in stunned silence. Even Maestro Harrington seemed at a loss for words. After a long moment, the conductor cleared his throat. "I've been conducting orchestras for 30 years, he said slowly. "In that time, I've worked with some of the greatest pianists in the world. What I just witnessed was unusual." Lee waited, hardly daring to breathe. "Your technique is different when your eyes are closed," Harrington continued. "Your posture, your touch, even your breathing changes. It's as if you become a different pianist entirely." He paused, then added reluctantly, "A better one." Lee felt a surge of hope. "Then you understand why I need to play this way?" "I understand that you believe you need to play this way," Harrington corrected. "But this is not a recital where you can do as you please. This is an orchestra, where the pianist must follow the conductor, must stay in perfect time with 50 other musicians. How can you do that with your eyes closed? It was a fair question, and one Lee hadn't fully considered. I can feel the music, he said. I can sense the orchestra around me follow the collective rhythm. Harrington looked skeptical. A bold claim. Let's put it to the test. He turned to the orchestra. From the beginning of the second movement. Full orchestra, and our pianist will play with his eyes closed throughout. Lee felt a flutter of nervousness but also determination. This was his chance to prove himself. He positioned his hands over the keys, closed his eyes, and waited for the maestro's downbeat. The orchestra began to play, and Lee listened intently, counting the measures until his entrance. When it was time, he joined in, his fingers finding the keys with certainty despite his closed eyes. He could feel the music of the orchestra surrounding him, supporting him, and he responded to each subtle change in tempo, each swell and fade in volume. They played through the entire second movement without stopping. When the final notes faded away, Lee opened his eyes to see Maestro Harrington regarding him with a complex expression, part amazement, part confusion, and perhaps a grudging respect. Well, the conductor said finally, it appears we have something of a musical oddity on our hands. For the next 3 days, Lee worked tirelessly with the orchestra, rehearsing Rachmaninoff's concerto until every note, every phrase felt natural. Maestro Harrington had reluctantly allowed him to play with his eyes closed during rehearsals, but the tension between them remained. The conductor watched Lee with a mixture of fascination and disapproval, as if he couldn't decide whether Lee was a musical genius or simply a stubborn rebel. He still doesn't trust me, Lee said to Min as they walked together toward the concert hall one morning. The rain pattered softly against their umbrellas, creating a gentle rhythm that matched their footsteps. Give him time, Min replied. Harrington spent his entire career doing things one way. You can't expect him to change his mind overnight. We don't have time, Lee reminded her. The concert is tomorrow night. Min nodded, her expression serious. I know. And we still haven't discussed the elephant in the room. Lee looked at her quizzically. The audience, Min explained. Harrington's concerned about how it will look to have a pianist performing with his eyes closed. He thinks it will seem theatrical, Lee sighed. It always came back to appearances. The classical music world was steeped in tradition, in prescribed ways of doing things. Innovation was welcomed in composition but rarely in performance. I don't care how it looks, Lee said. I only care how it sounds. And that's exactly why you're the right pianist for this piece, Min said firmly. But you need to convince Harrington of that before tomorrow night. When they arrived at the rehearsal hall, the atmosphere was tense. The other musicians spoke in hushed tones, glancing occasionally toward Maestro Harrington, who stood at his podium reviewing the score with unusual intensity. What's going on? Lee whispered to Min as they took their places. Before she could answer, Harrington looked up, his gaze fixing on Lee. Our soloist has arrived. Good, we have much to discuss. Lee felt a chill run down his spine. The maestro's tone was ominous, as if he'd made some kind of decision overnight. Had he found a replacement pianist after all? Was Lee about to be dismissed? As you all know, Harrington addressed the entire orchestra, tomorrow night's performance is significant. The mayor will be in attendance, along with several major donors and critics. The reputation of our orchestra depends on absolute professionalism and excellence. He turned his attention fully to Lee. Which brings me to our discussion from yesterday. I have given considerable thought to your unusual performance method. Lee held his breath, waiting for the verdict. I've consulted with the board of directors, Harrington continued, and we are in agreement that having our soloist perform with his eyes closed presents certain concerns. A murmur ran through the orchestra. Lee felt his heart sink. After all his hard work, after proving that he could play perfectly well with his eyes closed, was he still going to be forced to compromise? However, the maestro said, holding up a hand to quiet the murmurs, we cannot deny the quality of the music produced. And in the end, that is what matters most. Lee looked up, hope flickering in his chest. Therefore, we have reached a compromise, Harrington announced. You may play the concerto with your eyes closed during the more introspective passages and the cadenzas. But for the sections where precise coordination with the orchestra is paramount, your eyes must be open, following my direction. Lee wanted to protest that he had already demonstrated his ability to coordinate perfectly with the orchestra, even with his eyes closed. But he bit his tongue. This was a compromise, not a complete victory, but it was better than nothing. "Thank you, Maestro," he said, inclining his head respectfully. "I appreciate your flexibility." Harrington's expression remained stern. "Don't thank me yet. Today's rehearsal will determine whether this arrangement is viable. If there are any issues, any lapses in coordination, we will revert to the traditional approach." The rehearsal began, and Lee did his best to follow the maestro's compromise. He kept his eyes open during the orchestral introductions and the faster, more technically demanding sections where the piano and orchestra needed to stay in perfect sync. During the cadenzas and the more lyrical passages, he allowed his eyes to close, letting the music flow through him without visual distraction. It was awkward at first, this switching back and forth. Lee felt as if he were two different pianists, one constrained, one free. The transitions between these states were jarring, disrupting the natural flow of the music. After an hour, Harrington stopped the orchestra with a sharp tap of his baton. "This isn't working," he said flatly. "The inconsistency is worse than either approach on its own. The contrast between your playing with eyes open and closed is too dramatic. It makes the performance feel disjointed." Lee nodded, relieved that the maestro had noticed the problem too. "It feels unnatural to keep switching," he admitted. Harrington paced in front of his podium, deep in thought. The entire orchestra watched in silence, aware that they were witnessing a critical moment. "Perhaps," Min suggested carefully from her seat among the first violins, "we should consider the historical context of the piece." All eyes turned to her. Rachmaninoff himself was known for his emotional, almost mystical approach to performance, she continued. He wasn't bound by the rigid conventions of his day. Maybe this concerto calls for something beyond the ordinary. Harrington considered her words. "You're suggesting we allow Lee to play the entire concerto his way." "I'm suggesting we honor the spirit of the music," Min clarified. "If Lee's approach brings out something special in this particular piece, perhaps that's more important than adhering to convention." The maestro was silent for a long moment, his internal struggle visible on his face. Finally, he turned to Lee. "Play the opening of the third movement," he instructed. "With your eyes open." Lee positioned his hands over the keys and began to play. The third movement was fast, fiery, a stark contrast to the lyrical second movement. Lee executed the notes perfectly, his fingers flying across the keys with technical brilliance. "Now close your eyes," Harrington said when Lee had played for about a minute. Lee did as instructed, and immediately the music changed. The notes were still perfect, the tempo still precise, but now there was something else, a wildness, a passion that hadn't been there before. The melody seemed to soar, to take on a life of its own. Lee's body moved with the music, his face expressing the emotions that flowed through his fingers. When he finished, there was a moment of silence. Then several orchestra members broke into spontaneous applause. Harrington raised his hand, silencing them, but his expression had softened. "I have been conducting orchestras for 3 decades. He said slowly. "In that time, I've worked with pianists who could play the most technically difficult pieces without a single error. I've worked with musicians who knew the theory of music so thoroughly they could analyze any composition down to its smallest component. But rarely have I encountered someone who truly becomes the music when they play." Lee waited, hardly daring to hope. "Tomorrow night," Harrington said, his voice firm but no longer unyielding, "you will play Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3 as it was meant to be played, with passion, with heart, with soul. If that means playing with your eyes closed, so be it." A wave of relief washed over Lee. "Thank you, Maestro," he said, genuine gratitude in his voice. "Don't thank me," Harrington replied. "This is not a favor. This is an artistic decision, one I should have made sooner." But his expression grew serious again. "There is one condition." "What's that?" Lee asked cautiously. "The audience must understand. They must know that this is not some theatrical gimmick, but an essential aspect of your artistic interpretation." Lee nodded. "I agree completely. But how do we explain it to them?" "We'll include a note in the program," Harrington decided. "A brief explanation of your unique relationship with the music. And before the performance, I will say a few words to prepare the audience for what they're about to witness." The rehearsal continued, and this time Lee played the entire concerto with his eyes closed. The difference was remarkable. Without the disruption of switching between two playing styles, the music flowed naturally from beginning to end, building to an emotional climax that left several orchestra members visibly moved. After the final notes faded away, Harrington nodded, a rare smile softening his austere features. "That," he said simply, "is how Rachmaninoff should sound." As the orchestra members packed up their instruments at the end of rehearsal, Min approached the piano where Lee was gathering his sheet music. "You did it," she said, smiling warmly. "You won him over." "We did it," Lee corrected her. "I wouldn't have had the courage to stand my ground without your support." Min shook her head. "All I did was give you a little push. The music did the rest." "Do you think the audience will understand?" Lee asked, a trace of anxiety creeping into his voice. "What if they think I'm being strange or showing off?" "Once they hear you play," Min assured him, "they won't care whether your eyes are open or closed. They'll only care about the music." As they walked out of the concert hall together, Lee felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness about the coming performance. Tomorrow night would be the realization of his lifelong dream, playing as a soloist with a major orchestra. Yet he couldn't shake a lingering worry. "What if Harrington changes his mind?" he asked Min as they paused outside the building. "What if at the last minute he decides it's too unconventional after all?" Min considered this possibility. "Then you'll have a choice to make," she said finally. "Compromise your art to keep the opportunity, or stay true to yourself and risk losing it." "When you put it that way, it's not really a choice at all," Lee replied. "I can't play any other way." "Not anymore. Not now that everyone has heard the difference." "Then you have nothing to worry about," Min said confidently. "The music will speak for itself." As Lee headed back to his hotel room that evening, he felt more certain of his path than ever before. Whatever happened tomorrow night, he would play the concerto his way, with his eyes closed, his heart open, and his soul fully immersed in the music. It was the only way he knew how to honor Rachmaninoff's masterpiece, and the only way he could be true to himself as an artist. The evening of the concert arrived with a buzz of anticipation. Outside the Belworth Concert Hall, people dressed in elegant attire lined up to enter, their excitement palpable in the cool night air. Posters announcing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3 flanked the entrance, with the orchestra and Maestro Harrington's names prominently displayed. In smaller print at the bottom was Lee's name as the guest pianist. Backstage, Lee paced nervously in a small dressing room. He wore a borrowed tuxedo that was slightly too large for his frame, the sleeves extending just past his wrists. His reflection in the mirror showed a young man transformed from the disheveled traveler who had arrived at the rehearsal hall just 4 days ago. His hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved, but his eyes still carried the intensity that came from years of struggling to be recognized for his talent. A gentle knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, expecting to see Min or perhaps a stage manager. Instead, Maestro Harrington entered, already dressed in his conductor's attire, his silver hair combed back perfectly. Lee straightened immediately, surprised by the visit. "Maestro," he greeted, uncertain why the conductor had come to see him. "Lee," Harrington nodded, his expression serious but not unkind. "I wanted to check on you before the performance." "I'm ready," Lee assured him, though his rapid heartbeat suggested otherwise. Harrington studied him for a moment. "You know, when you first arrived, I thought you were completely wrong for this orchestra. Too unconventional. Too unpolished." Lee remained silent, unsure where this conversation was heading. "But music isn't about polish," Harrington continued, his voice softening slightly. "It's about truth, and there's a truth in your playing that I haven't heard in a very long time." Lee felt a surge of emotion at this unexpected praise. "Thank you, Maestro. That means a great deal coming from you." "I've added something to my introduction tonight," Harrington said. "A brief explanation about your approach to the piano. I want the audience to understand what they're about to witness." Lee nodded gratefully. "I appreciate that. But I need to ask you something," Harrington added, his tone becoming more serious. "This connection you have with the music when your eyes are closed, this ability to see music as something more than notes on a page, where does it come from?" It was a question Lee had asked himself many times over the years. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've been playing like this since I was a child. My first piano teacher tried to break me of the habit. She'd tap my hands with a ruler whenever my eyes closed." Harrington winced at this. "Yet you persisted." I couldn't help it, Lee said simply. It just felt right. When my eyes are closed, there's nothing between me and the music. No distractions, no barriers. The notes become colors, textures, almost like a landscape I can move through. Harrington nodded slowly, as if finally understanding something that had puzzled him. In 30 years of conducting, I've seen many talented musicians, but I've rarely encountered someone with such a pure connection to music itself. He paused, then added with unexpected gentleness, "Don't ever let anyone take that away from you." With that, he turned to leave but paused at the door. 15 minutes until curtain, he said, his voice returning to its usual brisk tone. The hall is sold out. After the maestro left, Lee sat down, trying to calm his racing heart. A sold-out concert hall, hundreds of people waiting to hear him play. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. Another knock came at the door, and this time it was Min, already dressed in her performance black, her violin case in hand. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her face alight with excitement. "Nervous," Lee admitted, "but ready, I think." Min smiled. "Everyone's talking about the note in the program about you. People are intrigued." Lee hadn't seen the program yet. "What does it say?" "It explains that you have a rare form of musical perception that allows you to visualize the music when your eyes are closed," Min told him. Harrington wrote it himself. He called your playing a rare glimpse into music's purest form. Lee was stunned. Just days ago, Harrington had been dismissive of his playing style, calling it a gimmick, an affectation. Now he was presenting it to the audience as something special, something to be appreciated rather than criticized. "It's time," Min said, glancing at the clock on the wall. "They'll be calling places soon." Together they walked through the backstage area toward the wings of the stage. They could hear the buzz of the audience through the heavy curtain, the sound of hundreds of people waiting in anticipation. The stage manager approached them. 2 minutes, he said quietly. "The maestro is about to go on to make his introduction." Lee nodded, his mouth suddenly dry. Min gave his arm a reassuring squeeze before leaving to join the other violinists at the stage entrance. From his position in the wings, Lee could see Maestro Harrington walk onto the stage to enthusiastic applause. The conductor approached the microphone set up at the front of the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrington began, his voice commanding immediate attention. "Tonight we present Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3, one of the most challenging and beautiful works in the classical repertoire. Before we begin, I'd like to say a few words about our guest pianist, Lee." Listened intently as Harrington spoke about him with a respect he'd never expected to hear from the demanding conductor. In the world of classical music, we often become bound by tradition, by the way things have always been done, Harrington was saying, but occasionally, we encounter a musician who reminds us that music is not just about following rules. It's about connecting with something deeper, something beyond the notes on the page. The audience was silent, captivated by the maestro's words. "Our soloist tonight approaches the piano in a unique way," Harrington continued. "When he closes his eyes, he doesn't disconnect from the music. He connects with it more deeply, experiencing it as colors, shapes, textures. What you will witness tonight is not a performance technique, but a rare glimpse into music's purest form. I invite you to close your own eyes at times during this performance, to experience the music not just with your ears, but with your hearts." With that, Harrington turned and gestured toward the wings where Lee stood waiting. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our guest pianist, Lee Wei." The audience applauded as Lee walked onto the stage. He bowed first to them, then to Harrington, and finally to the orchestra. As he took his seat at the grand piano, adjusting the bench to the right height, he felt a strange calm descend over him. All the nervousness, all the doubt seemed to evaporate as his fingers hovered over the keys. Harrington took his position at the podium, raised his baton, and with a small nod to Lee, began. The orchestra played the opening measures, the haunting melody that would soon be taken up by the piano. Lee counted silently, waiting for his entrance. When the moment came, he placed his fingers on the keys and began to play, his eyes open at first, watching Harrington's baton as they had agreed. But as the music progressed, as the simple opening theme gave way to more complex passages, Lee felt the familiar pull. The urge to close his eyes, to fully immerse himself in the music, became overwhelming. He glanced at Harrington, who gave him a subtle nod of permission. Lee's eyes drifted closed, and instantly the music transformed. Colors swirled behind his eyelids, deep blues and purples for the minor passages, brilliant golds and reds for the major themes. His fingers found each note with perfect precision, and his body swayed with the natural rhythm of the music. He was only vaguely aware of the orchestra around him, of Harrington's conducting, of the hundreds of people watching in the audience. In his mind, he was alone with the music, walking through a landscape of sound, exploring its peaks and valleys, its light and shadow. The first movement built to its climax, the cadenza approaching. This was the moment Lee had been waiting for, the extended piano solo where he could fully demonstrate his connection to the music. His fingers flew across the keys, finding complex patterns, building tension, creating moments of both thunder and whisper. When the cadenza ended and the orchestra rejoined, Lee opened his eyes briefly to find Harrington watching him with an expression of wonder. The maestro's conducting had changed, becoming more fluid, more responsive to Lee's interpretation. It was as if they had found a new way to communicate, beyond the visual cues of baton and nod. The first movement ended to enthusiastic applause, but Lee barely noticed. He was already preparing himself for the second movement, the slow, lyrical heart of the concerto. This time he closed his eyes from the first note, trusting completely in his ability to feel the orchestra around him. The second movement flowed like a river, each note connecting to the next in an unbroken stream of emotion. Lee felt tears forming behind his closed eyelids as he played, the beauty of Rachmaninoff's melody almost too much to bear. When the final movement began, fast, fiery, technically demanding, Lee remained in his state of musical immersion. His fingers seemed to know exactly where to go, finding each note with a certainty that came not from his mind but from somewhere deeper. He and the piano were one entity, the boundary between musician and instrument completely dissolved. As the concerto reached its powerful conclusion, Lee poured everything he had into the final passages. His body moved with the music. His face expressed every emotion contained in the notes. When he struck the final chord, the sound resonating through the concert hall, there was a moment of complete silence. Then the audience erupted. The applause was deafening. Accompanied by cheers and cries of "Bravo!" Lee opened his eyes, momentarily disoriented as he returned to the physical world. The entire audience was on its feet, their faces showing the impact the music had made on them. Harrington extended his hand to Lee, pulling him up from the piano bench for a bow. There was respect in the maestro's eyes now, and something more, a recognition of Lee as a fellow artist, a true musician. As Lee took bow after bow, he caught sight of Min among the first violins, her face beaming with pride. She had believed in him from the beginning, had encouraged him to stay true to his unique way of experiencing music. In that moment, standing on the stage of the Belworth Concert Hall with applause washing over him like waves, Lee realized that his journey had only just begun. There would be more concerts, more challenges, more people who might question his unconventional approach to the piano. But he would never again doubt himself or his connection to music. He had found his truth at the keyboard, and in doing so, had touched something universal that resonated with everyone who heard him play. The piano that Maestro Harrington had once forbidden him to touch was now the instrument of his triumph. And his eyes, whether open or closed, would always see the music in a way that was uniquely his own.